Now, if we jump forward to the final centuries of the first Christian millennium, it seems that the British Isles was particularly receptive in liturgy and imagery to Mary. Can you say why you think that was?
It's very evident in the sort of 10th and 11th centuries, partly because once the Normans come to England in the 11th century, they look at these Marian practices, these very precocious Anglo-Saxon traditions in the English language, in Old English, and they say, ooh, what is this? How, these local peculiarities, and they try to import with them a sort of European, reformed, very sort of Roman type of practices, which don't include at that moment a lot of attention to Mary, although they soon will. So there's a peculiar struggle over the sort of Marian traditions as something quintessentially English and unfamiliar to the conquerors, all the new bishops who come from Normandy, and which has to be controlled. But the thing is that it makes us all the more aware, therefore, that England really had its own trajectory, and that England, and to some extent Ireland as well, were very interested in the figure of Mary, even in the centuries of the earlier Middle Ages, when indeed in Europe there is not much of a cult of Mary at all. And scholars have explained that by quite independent contacts that the British Isles had with Byzantium, with Iberia, where there were other traditions of Mary that they could learn, that they could work on. And so there's a tremendous sort of devotional poetry, there's a lot of sort of carvings, ivories, and there are traditions even of feasts, like the Feast of Mary's Conception, that seem to be a sort of English, early sort of English invention. Of course, after the Norman conquest, when England sort of goes more mainstream and gets drawn in, because of course its rulers are both rulers of northern France and northern and central France and England as well, it joins just at the moment when Europe itself starts developing a great interest in Mary, in the monasteries, in the cathedrals. It joins with gusto the age of, sort of early Gothic, and then of course there's not so much of a difference. But definitely at the moment of the Norman conquest, the conquerors come and they do sense that English religious houses have this enhanced interest in Mary and her life, and a lot of the stuff is apocryphal indeed. It's not in the scriptures. So what do we make of this? But later on, in a way, with a sort of more, as European religious culture becomes more sort of uniform in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, of course England is just part of it in a rich theme of what is a much more general trend.
I was fascinated by the way in which you delineate the emergence of the Mater Dolorosa figure in art, going from a fairly sort of static, not very expressive figure at the foot of the cross to really an embodiment of all human suffering, pain and loss. When did that really begin to become part of the way that Mary was expressed in art?
Again, even just going back to Gospels, is precious little. I mean, most of the Gospels do not actually mention Mary in the crucifixion, so this is not at all an obvious theme. But I think that with the development of a sort of sensibility around suffering of Jesus, it's a theme that was very much developed in monasteries, because inasmuch as monks sort of offer themselves in a way to a sort of a life of chastity and prayer and so on, in a sort of imitation of Christ, we start getting a much more sort of attention to suffering of Jesus, and as Mary is to the fore increasingly, then the two sort of meet. What does it mean if Christ suffered on the cross? Then just imagine how his mother felt as well. So there's a way in which these sort of appreciations, these sort of aperçus are sort of worked out into sort of various logical conclusions that are also expressed visually. But what's really important is also that Mary, in her humanity, in the fact, she's not a god, she is a human like each one of the believers. She's just absolutely the perfect person to represent exactly how the believer might relate to the crucifixion. So it's really interesting to see that in a way she's standing at the foot of the cross, and devotional writings and sermons encourage you, the believer, to say, just like Mary at the foot of the cross, imagine yourself there beholding. I mean, you're not crucified quite, but you can be the one who really compassionately participates, and it's that imagining that creates, even then of course reinforces the sort of intimacy of people's sense of Mary and her suffering. And this is true not only for women but for men as well. And And indeed, it's really striking when one goes even nowadays to sites of commemoration, I don't know, of the fallen of the First World War, of other wars. The figure of the Pietà, of the mother just holding, you know, the body of a fallen son of whatever tradition, I think is one that has a tremendous universal appeal, and people know what it's about, and people don't feel offended even if they're Jews or Protestants or whatever, to engage with this figure because it does capture that, you know, the most appalling loss, which is, you know, a parent losing a son, a mother losing a child.
And I suppose that sort of humanization expressed in the Pietà is also related to Mary's intercessive powers, which again seem to develop as the centuries go by.
Oh, absolutely, very strongly. This notion that Mary and her son have a very special type of intimacy between them. It's not only that, you know, literally she bore him in the flesh. It's not only that they went through life together, and often devotional writers emphasize, you know, they did all these little banal things that parents and children do together and bond them so very much. And also when you think of all those images of mother and child at the breast and so on, they're touching and smiling at each other. There's always a sense of tremendous physical and emotional intimacy, which is really developed by Europeans in the beginning of the second millennium of Christianity. So all that also means, well, of course, if they're so close, then of course if Mary is on our side, if we appeal to Mary, she is surely the most appropriate person to try and intercede, because she's the person to whom he can deny nothing. So this closeness of Mary to Jesus works in so many different ways, as of course Mary as the absolutely best intercessor at the terrifying moment of judgment, but also of course as the one whose suffering was absolutely the greatest, which is of course this very, very rich theme. And you as the beholder, as the devotee, you can just try. You cannot do it actually, but you can just try to put yourself in her place. And the text literally increasingly emphasizes this, and devotional guidebooks. That continues in the Catholic tradition, of course, into modernity, of literally taking you by the hand like Mary through her eyes, situating you. And also pilgrims to the Holy Land, often guidebooks for pilgrim as they do the sort of, you know, Via Dolorosa, which is still there, of course. You know, are guided in a way. And here Mary saw, and here she saw her son carry the cross, and here she saw him wipe his sweaty brow, etc.